With me today are three people who helped start the MREA 35 years ago, key leaders who brought their own brand to the outcome of forming MREA. And the way they designed it created an innovative organization, and we hope that you're learning more about how it was established will help you gain some ideas that you might be able to take back to your home districts. With me today are Glenn Shaw, Jerry Jensen, and Linda Kravinoff. It is so good to see all of you. Glenn, let's start with you. You were the founding force behind MREA, and you put together an initial board of directors and a bylaws for the organization that created the momentum to get MREA on the board as far as educational organizations in Minnesota. Tell us a little bit about why you designed MREA the way you did.
Well, there were a number of key steps. First of all, I had the opportunity to serve on the NREA, the National Rural Education Association Board of Directors, and participated in a number of their activities, including lobbying the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. New York had a strong state organization. Colorado and other states were looking at forming state organizations. Metropolitan schools in Minnesota already had organizations that they were members of that lobbied the legislature, and rural schools did not have a voice. So I just decided it's time. It's time for the formation of a Minnesota Rural Education Association.
All the players at the table is the way we came to talk about it. But you pointed out, Glenn, that this diverse governance structure was really one of the more important aspects of the organization, and it made it very unique among education organizations in Minnesota, many of which were sort of special interest. If you were a school board member, you were in the MSBA, if you were an administrator,
right.
So forth. And so the fact that MREA had this diverse all the players at the table model was exceptionally unique for the time. What do you think was the biggest long-term impact of that kind of structure?
Well, I think it enabled buy-in. It enabled not only school districts, but the people that participated in the school districts as parents of students. It just allowed everyone to come together at the table. And I think that's really what rural schools need. I think that's what all schools need, actually. So that's what I believe.
Jerry, you were a relatively brand new superintendent in those days, 1985. You were superintendent at Goodhue, and you were very involved in the legislative platform that was put together for MREA initially. Tell us a little bit about what MREA wanted to accomplish.
Well, I think, first of all, as Glenn said, we realized there was a big void out there. We didn't have a voice. There wasn't anybody out there really advocating for rural schools and what rural schools needed. And I think what we brought to that legislative table, again, what Glenn mentioned was that unique membership makeup. That makeup was very powerful and was able to give us a lot of credibility when we went in. So right away, I think we had kind of heads up on everybody, because they were kind of amazed at, one, the membership and how it worked and how we could possibly even put together a legislative platform. But I think our platform that we worked on right away, it had the umbrella goal of always doing what is in the best interest of the students. And that has always been one of the bottom line or overriding goals of the organization, and it was carried out through the legislative part. And when we tried to build the legislative platform, we also tried to do it through a grassroots collection of ideas of what the needs are out there, and we talked about those things. And we knew that we had to have consensus at the table, and that was always kind of interesting because oftentimes the special interest representatives on the table, like the school board members or the teacher group, they had their own platform. So obviously they would want to try and bring in some of those ideas or planks from their platform to get it into the MREA platform. So we had a lot of discussion and debate about who was going to do what. And there were a number of topics that we decided we couldn't bring forward. Such as an example would be anything that might have to do with collective bargaining changes or things like that, because that was just too divisive for us. So the one thing that we really focused in on, and we knew there was a real disparity across the state, was funding. And that kind of started to be the main focus. Whereas if we could increase the funding equity in the state, that was going to benefit especially rural schools, because we knew there was a gap. And so I think funding equity really started to become the kind of the core of what our legislative focus was. And I think that helped bring everybody together. I was always, a number of years I sat as chair of that committee, and I was always very impressed with the ability of the group to come to consensus and be respectful and talk things through and end up coming up with a really solid, compelling type platform that we could take to the legislature.
In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that, Jerry, because in much of MRA's early history, you were the person who chaired that legislative action committee. So it was up to you to build that consensus and to, just by your very style, to make us listen to each other and agree on that learners were going to be first in what we decided.
I would beg to differ a little on that, because I don't think it was really up to me, Vernae. I just had the opportunity to be the chair of that committee and kind of facilitate the process. And, and granted, you want to try and make sure that people had an opportunity to have their voice heard and allow everybody to have their voice heard, and then make sure when it was heard that it was valued and it was respected. But the group really had to come up with the consensus, and they were the people that were really doing the heavy lifting. So I don't want to take more credit than is due. Thank you.
Beautifully said. Thank you for that. So Glenn, right about this time, in the bigger picture in the state of Minnesota, there was a lawsuit against the state about the fairness of education funding. And could you comment a little bit about how that played into the timing of the start of MREA and the impact it really had on MREA in those early years?
Yes, I would just like to say one thing about Jerry, and that is that he is absolutely right. In that whole legislative initiative, they always focused on the client, and the client was primarily the students, the children. And as long as you keep your eye on that ball, you're going to be right on the money. And I think that was, Jerry, your guiding light. That was what you were able to do. So regarding funding, first of all, I had a unique opportunity when I became the exec of Southwest West Central Educational Cooperative Service Units in 1976. We had 74 member schools and over 20 associate member schools. And working with all those school districts in rural Minnesota, it became apparent to me that funding was a major issue, whether it was teaching and learning or facilities or whatever rural schools were involved in. While it appeared to me that metropolitan schools did not have the same issues as we did. So Southwest West Central Educational Cooperative Service Unit was also ESV Region 3. Sally Toby was the director of ESV Region 3, a very bright, capable woman. So I met with Sally and I laid out the parameters of a study that I wanted her to do for us. And I'll never forget, she said something to the effect, what if the study does not find what you believe it will? Mm-hmm. What are we going to do? Or what if it finds the opposite of what you believe? And I said, then we're going to bury it and never talk about it again. So Sally did the study. Dr. Malcolm Toby was her husband, taught math at Southwest State. He verified the results of the study along with his colleagues, the math professors at Southwest State. We got the baseline data from the Minnesota Department of Education, Education Finance Division, and we took the results of the study and the methodologies back to them, and they verified everything. They verified every piece of it. So we knew that we had a solid study. Mm-hmm. The results were pretty astounding because in many cases it found that, for example, per pupil funding was much greater in metropolitan Minnesota than rural Minnesota.
No, I think that was a huge turning point in the legislative arm of the organization when Glenn was able to tap Sally Toby's expertise, because she just put together outstanding data that would back up any legislative proposals that we put forward. It was hard to argue. Minnesota, I think there is a kind of a widespread value that's accepted in Minnesota of being fair. And and when you take that to legislators, it's hard for them to argue when you have that kind of data and how unfair rural schools were being treated. So it gave us a huge arsenal to bring into those meetings. And I think that's what helped make us as effective as we were over those very early years.
Very well said and described. In those years, we had in Minnesota the Minnesota Miracle, which provided for a basic per pupil funding amount. And I do believe that the concept was that most districts were even because we were all getting the same basic formula per pupil. But it's the way that metropolitan districts were able to enhance their funding with excess levies or operating referendums. Yes. That had really thrown everything out of whack. And that was completely dependent then on the tax base in your district, et cetera, et cetera. And right. Thus for fairness in other ways. So I'm glad that you discussed that.
Vernae, we cannot lose sight of the fact that you, as the executive director of MREA, carried that ball. You made that happen, Vernae, and that was extremely important. You pounded the halls of the legislature. And of course, the lawsuit,
Yeah,
that was really, really important. So thank you for doing that.
thank you. But this is definitely a team effort. Linda, you came in, you and I were both school board members, and you were also a board member of a service cooperative and a board member of the MREA. And Linda becomes the chair of the board of directors at about the 5-year mark, 1991. And under Linda's leadership, the MREA board is restructured. And I'd like her to tell us a little bit about the efforts that she made, because that structure is in place yet today. It was so important. So tell us a little bit about what you accomplished, Linda.
Well, I think at the time when you look at the state of Minnesota and what was being able to be achieved by this group of people and their efforts through legislation, we wanted to involve more people. And so it was decided that we would divide the state in 3, a northern section, a central section, and a southern. And each of those sections then had their number of representatives. The teacher representative area is the one that really expanded under that. We went from having 1 teacher representative to having 3, 1 from each section. And I think it really empowered teachers to look at what went on a district-wide level, maybe differently than they had before, because now they saw themselves as being elevated from a position of responding to legislation that was created to having an opportunity to be part of what was developed and put forth to the legislation. And that, I think, gave them a real feeling of ownership for the financial responsibility of their district and the financial responsibility of the state. And so as we lobbied as a cohesive group, and I think that had a big impact on how the legislators looked at what we were doing in rural Minnesota. And then we were able to find common ground with some of the underfunded areas within the metro area. And it helped us grow and expand our power base, so to speak. And I think that teacher representation was a big part of improving, if you want to call it MREA, or improving our strength, probably is a better way of putting it. I think one of the things that is near and dear to my heart still is MREA, because it did so much to help the students in our district. And that's what we all were looking to achieve. It's not a personal gain, it's not a district gain, but it's a gain for each individual student, because when they have more of the resources they need, then they also have more growth and more potential for getting that equal education that Minnesota promises their students. So I applaud MREA today for what they have carried on with and as they continue to grow. And I'm proud to have been a part of the beginning of this organization.
Thank you. It was definitely enhanced by your leadership. At the time, and education in general was sort of governed by a labor versus management mindset. So those of you who were active at the local level, Jerry as an administrator, Linda as a board member, myself as a board member, we had sort of come through some times when there wasn't much common ground to be had, into an organization that really forced us to find common ground. Jerry, could you talk at all about the model, the governance model, and the difference it made?
I think as an individual school district, I think if you were a member of MREA and really embraced that membership and bought into what they were trying to accomplish with that diverse membership, bringing all of the groups together, and that included the community. We not only had our school, but we had the community component that we brought in, because that's really what rural schools are all about. We're all one big education community. But I think it did help ease some of the tension and contentious feelings that were in the individual districts. And you were right. It was basically a labor management, that battle was going on. But this was a place where even within the district, we could sit down and eat and go to these great conferences that MREA put on and bring those representatives along, and gave us an opportunity to sit down at the table and talk about programming ideas and all kinds of things that were not part of the contentious type discussions that we were having at the bargaining table. I think it helped heal a lot of healing within those districts as a result of what MREA was trying to accomplish. At least that's how I felt about it.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. Linda, who chairs the board in 1991, is followed the next year by Maxine Pennis, who was a teacher, chemistry teacher in Middle River and Greenbush. And then Maxine becomes the first teacher to be chair of the board of directors. So I think in 7 short years after the beginning of the organization, we really model what it is like for all of the players at the table to have a chance to lead and bring their skills forward. And since Maxine, we've had 6 teachers over the 35 years as chairman of the board, or chair of the board, which is, I think, a real measure of our success. We've also had 11 administrators chair the board and 10 school board members, like Linda, chair the board. We've also had a couple of service cooperative directors, like Glenn, as chair. 2 higher ed people have chaired the board, and then some of the at-large community that we encourage to be involved in MREA, who aren't necessarily educators, have also been chair. What do you think is the lasting benefit of the kind of governance structure that you have helped put in place? Is there anything more that you would like to add?
I think one of the lasting benefits is the realization that we're not on different sides, which too often, like you said earlier, when you're working in your own local school district, things do become contentious at times, simply because usually it's a money matter. Because let's face it, if we had the money, we would do anything, right? We would give our kids, we'd give them the moon if we could, because we're parents first and foremost, and we always want what's better for our kids. But the fact of the matter is that money is an issue, and it continues to be an issue today. I still see a disparity in what haves and have-nots have between metro and rural. And I'll use an example. I have a granddaughter in soccer, and I went to a tournament of hers in St. Michael, and I could not believe the field that they played on. I mean, they had scoreboards like NFL teams have scoreboards. It just blew me away. And I know that's a brand new facility, but it was state of the art, fantastic. And let's face it, we do not have that in rural Minnesota. That's extracurricular. That's not education per se. But anyway, it's an example of what I see still as a disparity. But I think what MREA was able to do is to take those contentious issues and lay them bare at our table. And that as we all looked at them, we could see that we were all on the same page and that we needed to all be on the same page and to move forward with common goals of improving the bottom line for our students. And I think that MREA has managed to achieve that in a lasting way. That's my take on all of it. So,
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Jerry, Glenn?
Well, just to pick up on what Jerry and Linda have talked about in terms of funding equity, I have given that some thought in preparation for this get together. I did not know if it was going to come up or not, but if you take a metropolitan school district and one teacher teaching Spanish, 5 sections of Spanish, as an example, of 25 students each section, and if you then average that, that's 25 per pupil units, and I know that's just a very, very rough example.
The lasting benefits of the organization is that the structure has survived all these years,
right.
with basically the same structure. And that says something for it. I think we've had tremendous success in the financial area of trying to bring about more equity, at least in terms of property rich, property poor, equalizing some of those levies. Just looking at that gap between the 5th and 95th percentile, that one, I still love that one, because I'm sure you were at the table, Glenn, when we thought that one up and came up with the 5th and 95th, and all of a sudden that became the standard and it's written into law. And I just get a kick out of that. But I think it was fair, and it was a good way to take a look at things. But I think we can't lose sight of the fact that there's more to just legislative gains that this organization was able to accomplish, but they were able to ward off things that would have been damaging. And as a watchdog, to make sure, like when they started talking about mandatory consolidation of school districts and the criteria they're going to use and how they were going to put together these school districts, and we had to have a voice there to say, no, that's not the way to do it. That the better way to do it is to have voluntary cooperation and coordination and consolidation of these districts and put some incentives in place. And they did that. So I think there were a lot of, we could get into teacher licensure and trying to make sure that we weren't allowing legislation to come in that made it more restrictive than it already was, because we needed more flexibility because of the way that our classes are structured. So I think there were just so many things over the years, besides even the funding, we made tremendous gains. But I think there are also a whole host of other areas that MREA played a critical role in protecting what our kids needed in terms of programming and quality teachers and things like that. So I think that's another one of the components of MREA that has contributed to the lasting benefits. It's kind of unseen what those things may have ended up doing to rural schools, because they didn't come to fruition.
Gary, that was beautifully said. So in 35 years, we went from having all the players at the table to having equal players at the table in terms of equal voices that we're going to put learners first in their school districts and in our legislative action. And that is one of the greatest benefits that these founders achieved on behalf of those students everywhere in Minnesota. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Linda, for sharing this. And I hope for those of you who are learning more about the founding of MREA, you better understand now how significant the governance of this organization is to its long-term effectiveness and the legacy that it leaves. So thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Vernae.
Thank you, Vernae.
We've learned how MREA began, and now we want to introduce you to two players who were able to take MREA to the next step, becoming the voice of Greater Minnesota education and making it a key player in education policy. Jerry Ness, Fred Nolan, and Rhonda Bonstetter. Jerry, you've seen the MRA from many angles and once described it as a think tank. Why did you call it that?
So instead of saying, no, we're against this charter schools, or you name the topic, we'll sort through it, we'll vet through it, we'll flesh it out. And so when you have your administrators, superintendents, typically at the table, along with school board members and teachers, and having the conversation, bringing in different resources, legislators and college profs, and just lots of different angles to a conversation, we talk it through. And I think that's probably a pretty apt description of a think tank is let's put it all together. Let's look at it from all different sides and then make your platform plank. And I think that's the strength of MREA is having good conversations related to any aspect that comes to our doorstep. And I think MREA is kind of the poster child for thinking through that way. And not everyone else has that. MREA is really for schools and communities and making sure that we think things through and support the right way that will make sure rural education remains very strong.
That is such a good example. I'm really glad you brought that up. I remember that moment in time because we were all sort of locked in our no boxes coming out of the roles we were playing in districts. But with MREA, we had to look at this issue from a standpoint of, so what if we put the learner first, or the student first here? Then what would we say about this public policy? And that
and I think I'm assuming I wasn't part of it at the time, but when open enrollment came into play, there was a lot of angst regarding open enrollment. But I would say, in the long run, it's still it still can be troublesome. Transportation specifically and different things with open enrollment. But I think it's made us better, in the sense that the competition is not something that public education thrives on, but we've had to learn how to be good to your neighbors, but then also when you're looking at what's best for the student, maybe it is best for that student to be in the next district. They have a program where they get along better over there. But it's always then, when I was superintendent in Fergus Falls, we always wanted to be the number one option for all students. So you worked hard to be that option, but it not always the case. That's just the reality of things. So I think maturity is a great thing. And I think open enrollment, charter schools, all of these things have matured into the entities that they are. And the latest one, online learning, is we've gone through that, and there was a lot of angst on online learning, and now I think people are learning to live with all these different, I'm not sure if they'd be threats to you, but definitely different modems of operation that we've had to work through. It's we've changed, and MRA has been right there supporting things as we go along and helping us sort through what's good, what's bad, and what we should keep and what we shouldn't, and all of those things. So there's, going back to the think tank, I think that's the example. Those are some examples, I should say.
You certainly played a variety of roles within MREA. You came on as a principal, became a superintendent, then you became the executive director. Tell us a little bit about how you saw the tensions between the players and how, as a leader, you chose to try to dispel them, and how out of that sometimes came creative solutions.
Right. I think there's some things that MREA when it gets really based into unions and different things that we don't dive in a lot, at least we didn't at that time, related to those things. So some things, looking at what's for the common good, platform plank number one for the last how many years has been adequate funding for our school districts. We can all agree on those. So there's enough on the table, enough on our plate that we can agree on and go after that are very, very important, and then let the other organizations or unions support those other things. So I think that's probably what we've done a good job of, and I was part of MREA, as a principal. There hasn't been many principals involved in MREA. And so that was my role when Kelly Smith nominated me, and I won on a 3-way tie, coin flip on it. Yeah, it's still kind of funny. You just kind of look at how your life changes on a coin flip, and that one certainly did, because it opened up my eyes to the state versus just my school district, rural school district in Western Minnesota. And then it actually led to a position with MREA, with the executive director role, and certainly helped me move into the Fergus Falls superintendency role, where I was the last 13 years of my career. So it certainly, affected me in a positive way, being involved and in the know and working through. So I think some of the other things with MREA is we transition. I was part of a lot of the transition where you decided you wanted, Vernae, I'm talking to you, that you were thinking more of your strength as a lobbyist was, the executive director role. The business part of it was probably getting in your way some, to be honest, and you loved the lobbying part. And so, moving from, to an executive director and a lobbyist, and then working through, grooming Sam, you bringing Sam in, and us as a MREA bringing Sam in as a role. And so I was part of some interesting things, and then also making sure we were the right lobbying organization structure and all that business. So it's been an interesting ride, the transition. And I think one of the key things that we transitioned was away from the LAC. When I came on to MREA, it was confusing that you were a board member, but you weren't necessarily into the legislative action component, which everyone comes on to MREA board and they want to be part of the action, and so being able to just say the board is the legislative action committee, I think that is just such a positive step. I just think we're so much better set. So now all of the players, all of the teachers, all of the soups, the administration, say all the school board members, you're all key role players in developing that platform. And as we look, I know we're going to move over to Fred here for a moment, but I think when you went from, I was a half-time superintendent and half-time MREA executive director when I was at West Central area, moving Fred to a full-time, well, first of all, expanding time, but then selecting Fred and his vision and just work ethic to get to every corner of the state. Boy, I couldn't be prouder of MREA. How, thinking we were at, thinking back in the day, we were at our peak. We were thinking, 150, that's pretty darn good, and now being at 225, I'm just amazed at the work that's been done by Fred and Sam, and love bringing in, Diane, Don, you really have a great team right now. And I just see great things in the future here, looking for the next 35, and just congratulate MREA and having the vision to move forward like that.
I am so glad you brought that up. Fred, when you came into MREA, you set some ambitious goals. You said that you were going to help MREA become the voice for Greater Minnesota education, that you were going to hold a premier rural education conference every year, and that you were going to fill in the membership map. And what Jerry and I are referring to is under our direction, we tried to expand membership. but we really reached a limit where we didn't think we could get any bigger. For example, all the range area districts were outside of our grasp. But you came in and proved that it can be done. Tell us a little bit about your contribution to MREA in that respect.
Well, thank you, Vernae and Jerry. And it has been a great run to follow Jerry and the previous directors and the board. And I think the thing that made the difference was bringing on Dawn and really focusing on communications, because we became kind of a greater Minnesota newspaper of education. Kind of the policies and funding issues were going on at the Capitol, and then also I instituted that we did the insider brief every other week throughout the year when there wasn't a session. And there were doubts about, was there going to be enough news? No, there was enough news. And so you couldn't get that even in the Fergus Journal because the journal wouldn't cover education to the degree that we did. And that's what I was able to sell to the other districts, because if they weren't an advocacy organization, and many of our rural districts were not a member of an advocacy organization, they didn't understand advocacy. They just thought laws just happened, okay? And it was only after they got the communication and started seeing how it went and seeing what was happening that they understood just how important it was. And then Sam and I were very strategic and just were relentless. But also just a couple of things. One superintendent said, you know, I've heard about MREA, I hear the reports, but nobody ever asked me to join. Just a simple, please join. And the other thing was that, you know, you built a big tent in terms of the advocacy. And so the range was able to get included because they saw that we were working on education policy where the RAMS organization was not. And so those two things, you know, really helped. But yeah, it was door-to-door sales. At first, we had nothing to sell. We actually batted below the Mendoza line. We had batted lower than 200% that first year with Sam. But then the momentum grew, and then it became easier and easier. And finally, the one superintendent, I remember telling his board, of course, why are we joining now? To get Fred off my back, so he'll stop calling me. And so persistence is, as you know, 90% of it in education and any effort. So no, I'm very proud because now with over 80% of rural school districts, we are the voice. Sam is listened to at the Capitol. When he lays that map out in front of them and says, here's our map, especially to a new legislator, it's like, whoa, you can just see. When we got to about 170 or 180, I could just see the legislators' eyes as they would kind of lean back and look at us again. We weren't just somebody walking through the door anymore. And that has been very, very important, not only for the unified voice in Greater Minnesota to sort through the issues at the board table, but very much in St. Paul.
Very helpful. Jerry, while you're still here, you were the person who hired Sam. And
because you told me to.
no, but it is true that was a turning point for all of us in terms of bringing greater expertise to the legislative action. Did you know how impactful it was going to be?
You certainly could see the potential. Vernae, you actually did bring him. And you were working with him and sort of grooming him in ways. But I describe Sam as he's a gym rat. He loves that Capitol. He knows every corner of that Capitol, and he has the connections. And so if you take Fred, working around the state with connecting with every district, and being very persistent. And then you have Sam at the Capitol doing the same thing and then supporting each other that way. That was quite a winning combination. So, you always thought the potential was there, but nowhere in my wildest dream did I think, he would be that successful and MREA grow into what it is. He's done well.
So Jerry, you're interesting because you moved from being MREA's executive director to a superintendency in Fergus Falls, and then you come back to the MREA board, which
Yeah,
is
to Fred's nightmare there, that's what someone told me. Go, can you imagine Fred's thinking about you being back on the board? I'm going, and I didn't really think of it that way because I was supporting Fred and whatever he was doing. And to be honest, the reason I did that is I missed the action, to be very honest. I miss being in the know. There's nothing like, you can read all of your newsletters which are great, but there's an excitement, or there's just about being in that boardroom and talking through the issues. I missed that, and I knew I would have one 4-year segment left, if you will, and then I was retiring, and so it was good for me to get back. Get back in. Fred, you don't have to comment on that one. So.
No, Jerry, it was great to have the history. So if something came up, I know I could give you a call and ask you, Jerry, what's the history here? What's going on with this issue, with this person? And that was really helpful. And Vernae, I have something to add on Sam when you come back to it. So.
No, please take it away.
Oh, well, the thing you mentioned, Jerry, Sam has incredible retail skills, and he knows people and knows their names. Yep. And for example, the current chair of the House Policy Committee, Cheryl Joachim, started out as a staffer for one of the senators, and he was kind to her then and knew her then. And when they connected, when she became chair, he said, I am so pleased to be able to say, Madam Chair. And because they'd known each other for over a decade.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But the other really great thing is he is the most strategic thinker you're going to run into. Yep. It's not just the retail, it's the strategy. It's the deep thinking. It's thinking 2 or 3 chess moves ahead. It's thinking about the entire chessboard. Some of the greatest times I had with him when he and I would go on the road and have the windshield time to debrief the past legislative session, talk about where we were, and then after an area meeting in our hotel room with an adult beverage. And let me tell you, MREA is so blessed. He's not only a fabulous retail lobbyist, but he is a deep strategic thinker, and very critical to our long-term success. So
I am so glad you have mentioned that. Fred, you're interesting in that you came to MREA not being immersed in the culture of MREA at the start. You had been in districts that weren't MREA members. So there's a part of our history that you're not so aware of. Mm-hmm. Knowing what you know now, what do you think is MREA's most important contribution to education leadership, as you viewed it sort of as an outsider? And now an insider.
Well, what's been said before, that MREA puts learners first and sincerely does that at the core when we get into deep issues. And as Jerry said, having all the voices at the table, mm-hmm. I would tell people over and over again that MREA is the only statewide organization that has all the roles with elected seats at our table, including higher education, including the service co-ops, but teachers, administrators, and school board members. And we worked really hard to make sure all the voices were heard, because it's not just in creating the platform, but it's when those issues come up at the legislature, as you know, Vernae, mm-hmm. such as the constitutional amendment, that nobody knew. Well, we certainly didn't see it on our horizon. But to have the board meet and really have a serious conversation, and Jerry, you probably remember that, for like an hour about what our response was to the constitutional amendment, that is so valuable, because these are people who've taken a bit of a time out of their day-to-day life working with kids in different roles and come together on an issue and work it out. And so that's what I see the contribution. And then to do that now with over 80% of the districts as members, okay, you've now really amplified that. Mm-hmm. All that work now has more more authority, more power, and also it goes back to more districts. So when the legislatures, or whether they're in the southeast part of the state in Caledonia or up in Kidston Central, they're hearing kind of the same message, tailored to their regions. But when they get back to the capital, they'll go, oh yeah, that's what I heard too. And that is also very important in creating an important and powerful voice.
Mm. You brought analysis and research into the directorship in a way it's never been done before. And I think it's one of the measures of MREA ongoing success, because we had Sally Toby initially, and then you just brought us full circle back to that kind of skill set. So tell us a little bit about some of the major legislative victories that you were able to win because you were research-based.
Well, let me also say, Vernae, that you left out when I got the job, when I was given the gift of this, I called you and said, okay, what, Vernae, should I do? And you said, Fred, if you can do anything, bring back the maps, because that's what MREA was known for. Sally Toby had done that, and we've sort of lost that for a period of time, unfortunately, due to her passing. When Dawn came on, I asked her if she knew a programmer who could do that, and she did, and that's how we have this mapping capacity. But yeah, it's kind of my wonkiness. I do like numbers. I was a former math minor, and I've always felt that with data, you could get people into a rational discussion. If you could get them to look at the data and say, what's right, wrong with it, what should we do about it? It's not a he said, she said. It's less of a personal argument. You can actually have a civil discussion. And so that was important to me as a principal, as a superintendent, in moving districts forward. And so it was kind of a natural thing. When you say what was our most critical thing, the donut hole, the fact that they left districts like Jerry's out of a deal back in like 2014, I think. And Sam and I came up with that in the car. I remember, because that was the Medicare donut hole was such a big deal, okay? Yeah. The donut hole. So we drove it with the data that different districts were getting different amounts of money, and really no rhyme or reason to it. And that was very, very important. I would say though,
Fred, I want to interrupt you on that one. Yeah. The interesting part of that, I think Lee Warren was the exec in the education task finance. They were looking for someone, so they put me on it. And people know that's not my strength. But so here Melcher was leading every single week for 7 weeks or 8 weeks. We were doing this education task force finance. And the first week we had all this stuff, and then all of a sudden the next week we come and there's this COLA involved here, and all of us. So the city schools, if you will. There's this cost of living adjustment, and it was $424, I believe it was for them. And but I was a regional center, and people who know me, I was every single formula they came out with, the regional centers got the short end of the stick on every single one. It was just interesting. So then they came back and they gave regional centers $212. So that first year, we had the 212, the city schools had the 424, and then you and Sam get in the car, and I think it was Senator Scoy to say, hey, everybody's getting the 424, and thank you. That was awesome. little backstory there. So
right. But a couple other examples. One is not known quite so much is the aid to American Indian students. I put together data that showed that the poorest communities in Greater Minnesota, 10 out of the 15, were either in or around American Indian reservations. We pointed out that 2/3 the American Indian kids were educated in Greater Minnesota, and they had the worst graduation. It was actually the worst graduation in the nation, and worked very carefully with Dennis Olson, who was the American Indian Ed director at the time, and Casilius, and Senator Saxhog was really critical to that because of where he is in the Bemidji, Grand Rapids area with several American Indian reservations. So that was with data. One of my, at the legislature, Vernae, they always say, Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so or Dr. So-and-so. It's never first names, right? So Commissioner Casilius is at the testifying stand, and I'm sitting in the audience, and she's putting up one of our maps about the achievement and American Indian kids, and she said, "And I want to thank Fred for these maps and data." I mean, so yeah, it was well known in the Capitol and with Commissioner Casilius that we did that. But one of the things we did was what's now the local optional revenue of a board approved revenue up to $724, because we drove the point home. There were 54 districts with 0 operating referendum at one point. But I think the one that really capped it all, they used all the data, the branding, SAM skills, was Ag to School. And what is now moving to a 70% ag credit for school facilities. We pulled out all the stops, the age of buildings, the lack of a state share, the unfairness of farmers paying such a large burden in these small schools, and we caught a tailwind. The conference had kind of withered on the vine. Actually, the year before I became chair, there was only 87 paying attendees. So it had not really nurtured itself. And so we looked at our array of members and said, we really need to do something with teachers. We need to make this a professional conference. And that was with the board, did a strategic plan at the time, and that is they wanted a premier conference. And I remember telling them, I don't know if I told them, but I told myself, I'll give it 3 years. If I can't get this thing up in 3 years, then this is really an activity that's seen a better day. And it's because, as you know, Vernae, it's an immense sinkhole of effort for the director, the executive assistant, and now with the communication director. And so that first year, it was call on all my friends who I knew were running good things and said, please come and present, okay? And then we evolved into, when I went around the state and asked people for what they were proud of, I was really searching for things that would be good sessions, okay? And so I'd take that list and I would mine that and go back to those people and invite them to present. And then we created themes, because we found that teachers don't normally come, okay? And so we had one on transition from secondary to post-secondary. So we wanted counselors and teachers of concurrent enrollment and that level of teachers. Then we focused on early learning. Then we focused on the primary grades. Then this last one was kind of focused on the middle grades and how you engage kids through that time when they're going through change in their life through adolescence. And we became a premier conference that teachers and principals found more talking to their colleagues from rural Minnesota than their own professional conferences. Because the other thing we did, we heard feedback that we didn't have enough networking time. So we built networking time in. We built it in with a way to network across the state on issues, which we called mindstorming. We built it in by having the board have those hospitality rooms around the pool after dinner, okay? So you could get with your region or go around and see the different regions. I think that was really something special. But we really tried to focus on teachers and having greater Minnesota school districts and teachers share what they were doing. And because people wanted to hear what other districts in rural Minnesota were doing to solve the same problems. They don't want to hear what Mounds View was doing. They wanted to know what Foston was doing. And so that was the key, that people didn't go home and feel we wasted their precious time to drive all the way for 2 days, have to prepare for a substitute or whatever, and come back. That had to be absolutely high value time.
Yeah, thank you. Rhonda, you were a board chair of MREA. Jerry, you were a board chair as well. Can you offer some concrete examples of what becoming an organization that better serves rural teachers, what difference has it made at the district level?
I think it's provided that opportunity for teachers from the various districts to come together. Fred mentioned that going to their own professional conferences, that's gotten to be harder and harder to do with the shortage of subs and so on. But this has been the kind of conference that they know that they will come together with other rural teachers. They're not going to just meet up with metro teachers who may not have similar teaching situations to theirs. So they can meet together with other rural teachers who have a similar classroom setting to theirs and face similar challenges and that sort of thing. And I do think really just having the administration and the school board members and the teachers together at a conference is really important as well. You get some different perspectives than you do at a conference that is just for teachers or just for administrators. You get to hear all three. So you can go and attend those sessions. You're not locked out of anything just because you happen to be a teacher. So it provides some bigger opportunities to see a bigger part of the picture, I think.
Oh, that's an interesting point, to see the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That just leads me into it. So I won't talk about the conference, but just your weekly routines, if you will. So every week, the insider, the voice back in the day, those would come to me as a superintendent or a principal when I was a president, and I always forward them district wide. And so the key for me was when I was a teacher, I was a business teacher, and the most important thing ever is an accounting. Everyone needs to take accounting. That was my thing back then. But then you become a principal and you're going, oh my gosh, it's all about reading. It's not even close to accounting. Who cares? It's all about reading and math. You do those two things and speak well. Boom, you're going. So then you become a superintendent. And as you go, some say it's not up the ladder, but more responsibility in the fuller district. That way, you get farther away from that classroom. But in the different point of view is you're able to affect more learners. So as a business teacher in Herman, I had small classes, and then as a principal, West Central area, I was responsible for 600, and then as a superintendent in Fergus Falls, over 3,000. So you have more responsibilities. So to me, one of my goals is to broaden the horizons for the teachers. It's not just about their classroom. It's about so much more related to other things. And so what I would do, not only MREA things, but also other things I received from other organizations, I wanted to make sure that they had access to those, and they would read those and they'd comment on those, and everything from even our school board agendas and minutes and everything. There's a lot of business going on around a district that can affect their classroom. But then also, I think the biggest thing that with the conference, tied to the conference, I think the idea of the regional teachers of the year, if you will, from the regions. I think now all of a sudden, I think rural teachers go, hey, I've got a chance at northern Minnesota or central Minnesota, whereas, in Education Minnesota does a wonderful job of recognizing teachers of the year, and so does. So nothing to take away from that, but I'm a big believer in recognizing people. Why just recognize a few when you can recognize more, but for specific excellence? And I think that's been a bit of, I think it was Lee Carlson and others on the board that really give them a lot of credit. I was kind of going, really, do we want to do this? And then I saw how it worked and how the heartfelt stories at the conference, it just, wow. And Don Zimmerman really did a nice job doing the MC work on that. And it, I think it's just flourishing. And I think you'll see that if you want to involve someone, you recognize people, that you value people. And I think that's just a good example of how MREA is bringing the teacher in the fold. Because I think that was the struggle early on, probably for you, Vernae, and for me, certainly, is superintendents don't know when to shut up, and they kind of dominate the conversation. I mean, this is our livelihood, to know the finance, to know the business, know the policy. And so we were a school board member and a teacher, they're busy doing their classroom, and school board members are busy doing whatever job they have in board members. So really, that's our role in life, is to make sure our districts are protected and funded, So we tend to have more voice at the table than we should, just because we loud and talk over people. But now I think what we're doing is a much better job of recognizing that, and the superintendent's backing off, if you will, and getting input from others more. It's a better organization because of that.
I'm glad you brought up the awards, Jerry, and the Teachers of Excellence, because it was Lee Carlson and another board member who were so upset that Ed Minnesota didn't recognize anybody outside the Twin Cities, and made you put in a huge report in that nobody could do. And I remember Diane Vosen calling other states who had these, and her telling me that she talked to the director of Arizona, and he said he thinks it's the most important thing they do. And I realized, really? But I think now it is. It is one of the most important things we do. And it's long time, and plus now with the video, that the things are you can see them in their classrooms with sponsorship. That's a living legacy now for our entire profession, rural profession. And so it probably is one of the most important things we do.
Yes, beautiful. The story of MREA, as we are experiencing it in this video, is it began with the wisdom of having all the players at the table. But then under restructuring and through the years, the board became equal players. And that was so powerful in a labor versus management model of leadership. And so suddenly you have equal teachers and equal administrators and equal school board members and equal at-large community representatives. And it's at that point, I think, that Fred, your goal of making MREA a key player and expanding the impact of MREA through your staff and through your membership, that it did become the voice of education in Minnesota, and certainly the voice in Greater Minnesota. And now to the fact that we're going to empower and improve the opportunities for rural teachers to network and to get down and to have the same opportunities toward awards as other teachers in the state have had. It's a wonderful legacy you've put together.